Derica Moore was a familiar face in Cedarbluff, Mississippi, a young man known to neighbors and family. But on one cold January night in 2026, he turned from neighbor to nightmare, leaving 6 dead, including a child, and shattering the peace of an entire town. January 9, 2026, began like any other cold winter evening in Cedarbluff, Mississippi. The small rural town, surrounded by sprawling fields and winding dirt roads, was quiet, the kind of quiet that had always given its residents a sense of safety and familiarity. Families were finishing dinner, children were playing briefly before heading indoors, and streetlights flickered on, casting long shadows across the empty roads. To the untrained eye, nothing seemed amiss. But the calm would not last. Just before 7 in the evening, a single phone call to the sheriff's office changed everything. Reports of gunshots on David Hill Road, a narrow stretch lined with trailers and small homes, sent deputies racing into the night. The first responding officers were met with an unsettling stillness, broken only by the soft echo of tires crunching on gravel. At the first home, they discovered 3 bodies inside, victims of a sudden and violent attack. Glenn Moore, age 67, Quentin Moore, 33, and Willie Ed Geens, 55, were all found dead. Their lives abruptly ended in what investigators would later describe as a precise and deliberate act of violence. The scene was unnervingly calm for the devastation it held. There were no signs of struggle, no frantic attempts to escape, only the chilling remnants of a life snatched away without warning. The first responders struggled to process the scene. They were trained to handle tragedies, but the sheer intensity of what had unfolded in this quiet community left them shaken. The house, which had once been a place of laughter, conversation, and ordinary life, had been transformed into a silent monument to terror. News of the shootings spread rapidly throughout Cedarbluff. Neighbors watched from their windows, whispering in fear and disbelief. Some locked doors and drew curtains. Others huddled in their homes, unable to comprehend what had happened so close to them. The town, which had prided itself on its close-knit community and sense of shared trust, suddenly felt vulnerable and exposed. For many, the quiet streets that had once symbolized safety now seemed ominous, and every shadow held a hint of danger. As officers worked to secure the scene, it became clear that this was not an isolated incident. Evidence suggested the violence had been carefully planned, executed with a chilling calmness. Deputies found spent shells, carefully placed belongings, and indications that the perpetrator had considered every step of the attack. There was a method to the chaos, a calculated precision that set this crime apart from a moment of passion or random violence. By the time additional law enforcement arrived, the scope of the incident was becoming apparent. Calls from neighbors, reports of a stolen vehicle, and sightings of a suspicious figure moving along the back roads painted a picture of a spree rather than a single act. Cedarbluff, a town that had never experienced such horror, now faced an event that would redefine its sense of security forever. The night had begun as any other, but by the time dawn approached, the quiet rural town would bear the weight of grief, confusion, and fear that no one could have anticipated. The Cedarbluff Massacre had begun, and its impact would be felt long after the final shots were fired. The morning after the first shootings, Cedarbluff was already a town transformed. Where once there had been casual greetings between neighbors and the quiet hum of rural life, there was now a tense, almost suffocating atmosphere. Families peeked through curtains, unsure what to expect, while law enforcement moved carefully through streets that were now lined with yellow crime scene tape. The initial victims were more than names on a report. They were family, and the realization that a relative could be struck down in such a brutal, calculated manner left the community stunned. Glenn Moore, Quentin Moore, and Willie Ed Geens had shared blood, history, and connections that bound them to the neighborhood. Their deaths were not random. They were personal, and they marked the beginning of a night of escalating horror. Investigators traced the movements of the suspect, noting a disturbing pattern of deliberate action. After leaving the first crime scene, the suspect took possession of a pickup truck belonging to one of the victims. From there, he navigated Cedarbluff's winding back roads with purpose. The path he followed suggested premeditation and knowledge of the town's geography that few outsiders could possess. Law enforcement recognized immediately that they were not dealing with a random act of violence, but with a spree that would unfold across multiple locations. Residents began to recount incidents from the past that, in hindsight, appeared as minor warning signs. Pets had gone missing. Small fires had been reported in empty lots. Objects had been found damaged or displaced in ways that had previously seemed like adolescent mischief. At the time, these events had been dismissed, easily explained as accidents or pranks. But investigators began connecting these dots, realizing that the suspect's behavior had been escalating for months, and that the community had unknowingly been living under the shadow of preparation for something far worse. Throughout the morning, officers set up checkpoints and roadblocks, attempting to anticipate the suspect's next move. Families were advised to remain indoors, and schools and local businesses temporarily closed. The town's familiar rhythms were halted, replaced by a tense watchfulness. Maps of the area were dotted with points of interest, drawn to track potential targets and escape routes. Every decision by law enforcement was measured, with the knowledge that one misstep could lead to more casualties. The human cost of the attack was becoming evident as well. Beyond the immediate victims, the emotional trauma extended to friends, neighbors, and extended family members. Calls flooded emergency lines from terrified residents who feared for their loved ones, unsure if the spree would continue. Those who had previously walked the streets freely now hesitated, acutely aware of the danger that had infiltrated the town. The reality that someone in their midst could commit such acts shattered the sense of trust and safety that had defined Cedarbluff for generations. As the investigation continued, it became clear that the spree was methodical. Each act of violence was not only deliberate but strategically placed to maximize fear and disruption. Law enforcement pieced together the timeline, from the first shots at the mobile home to the movements along the winding roads. By understanding the suspect's choices, authorities hoped to prevent further deaths. For Cedarbluff, however, the damage had already begun. Families were grieving, the town's innocence was lost, and a profound sense of vulnerability had taken root. The night's tragedy was no longer contained to a single household. It was the shadow that hung over the entire community. The third stop in the tragic spree brought the full weight of horror to Cedarbluff. On Blake Road, a small family home became the stage for a moment that would haunt the town forever. Inside, a 7-year-old girl lost her life, an innocent child caught in the unthinkable path of violence. Another young child, moments away from harm, narrowly escaped, leaving a survivor to carry the trauma of witnessing a family member's death. The impact of this single act radiated beyond the immediate household. The community, still processing the first murders, was forced to confront the unimaginable. A child, a symbol of hope and innocence, had been struck down. Law enforcement officers described the scene as heart-wrenching. Toys scattered across the living room floor, a small chair knocked over, and the faint traces of blood in the dim light told the story of violence intruding upon the most vulnerable. Every detail suggested careful targeting, a chilling understanding of timing and opportunity. This was not random. It was deliberate, an escalation that crossed the boundary from property and adult victims into the realm of pure innocence. The investigators working the case were struck by the calculated nature of the attack, noting that the suspect had chosen his targets with precision, seeking maximum impact on both the victims and the community. The parents and siblings of the victims were left to process a grief that seemed unbearable. Within Cedarbluff, word spread quickly, each retelling adding layers of sorrow and disbelief. Families closed doors and drew curtains, watching for any sign that the violence might continue. Parents who had previously allowed their children to play outside freely now kept them close, acutely aware that danger could strike in the most ordinary settings. The town, once insulated by familiarity and trust, was now forced to confront the fragility of its safety. The incident also highlighted the emotional strain on first responders. Officers who arrived at the scene were unprepared for the scope of tragedy they encountered. Their training had prepared them for violence, but the presence of a child victim created a level of emotional intensity that tested even seasoned personnel. Each officer faced the difficult task of containing the crime scene, documenting evidence, and simultaneously shielding themselves from the emotional weight of what had occurred. As investigators worked, patterns began to emerge. The suspect had studied routines, observed household behaviors, and acted with a precision that suggested a disturbing level of foresight. The targeting of a young child was both calculated and symbolic, striking at the very heart of family and community trust. It was a reminder that no one, regardless of age or innocence, was immune from the reach of this individual's violence. For Cedarbluff, the events on Blake Road represented the point at which fear became fully tangible. The first victims had been adults, but the death of a child made the threat real in a way that could not be ignored or rationalized. Residents were left to grapple with questions that had no answers. Why this child? Why the escalation? And what could be done to prevent further tragedy? The town had entered a new, dark chapter, one in which the innocence of childhood was shattered, leaving grief and fear as the only remaining companions on the cold Mississippi night. The violence did not end with the deaths on Blake Road. As night fell further over Cedarbluff, the quiet grounds of the Apostolic Church of the Lord Jesus became the next scene of tragedy. Normally a place of worship and refuge, the church property was transformed into a site of sorrow and fear. 2 more victims, a pastor and his brother, were discovered inside a small residence on the grounds, their lives taken in a continuation of the night's brutal spree. Both men had dedicated themselves to serving the spiritual and emotional needs of the community, offering guidance, comfort, and counsel to families who trusted them. Their death struck not only their families but an entire congregation, leaving a spiritual void that amplified the grief already gripping Cedarbluff. Investigators noted the methodical nature of the attacks, recognizing that the spree had been carefully planned and executed. The locations of the killings were deliberate, each chosen to maximize the emotional impact on the town. The path from private homes to a place of worship demonstrated a chilling understanding of human psychology. By targeting those who were pillars of the community, the perpetrator struck fear into the hearts of Cedarbluff residents, making them question their safety, their routines, and their sense of trust in familiar surroundings. The crime scene at the church was solemn and haunting. Officers documented evidence with meticulous care, photographing the small residence, the interior spaces where the victims were found, and the surrounding grounds. Candles, hymnals, and personal belongings had been left undisturbed, yet the presence of violence in such a sacred space created a profound emotional weight. The investigators recognized that this location held symbolic significance, and its violation would resonate far beyond the immediate circle of family and friends. Families and neighbors reacted with a mix of grief and disbelief. Those who had known the pastor and his brother recounted stories of mentorship, kindness, and service, struggling to reconcile the men they knew with the reality of the violence that had ended their lives. The killings challenged the community's understanding of morality and safety, raising questions about how someone could carry out such acts without detection and why sacred spaces were not spared. Churches that had once been sources of comfort and unity now felt vulnerable, their sanctuaries no longer immune from the reach of violence. Law enforcement continued to coordinate their efforts, recognizing that the suspect had not only the ability to plan but also to adapt, moving from one location to another with precision. Teams worked to trace every step, using surveillance, witness accounts, and vehicle tracking to understand the suspect's movements and anticipate potential threats. Every hour was critical, and each new piece of evidence brought the investigators closer to capturing the individual responsible for this chain of devastation. For Cedarbluff, the killings at the church marked a turning point in the night's horror. The sense of community, of shared trust, had been shattered. Residents faced the painful truth that even their spiritual leaders could be taken, and that no place, however sacred, was guaranteed safety. The town's grief deepened as the night progressed, the weight of loss and fear settling into every corner of the community. By the time law enforcement prepared to make their final move to apprehend the suspect, Cedarbluff had been forever changed, its sense of innocence and security replaced by shock, sorrow, and an urgent need for answers. Hours after the last shooting, Cedarbluff was a town suspended in fear. Residents stayed behind locked doors, watching for signs of movement, while law enforcement coordinated an expansive response that included local deputies, the Mississippi State Patrol, and the U.S. Marshal Service. Every road leading out of the town was monitored, checkpoints were established, and officers combed the area for any evidence of escape. The atmosphere was tense, every passing car or shadow prompting a flurry of activity and nervous anticipation. Cedarbluff, a community that had only known peace and routine, now existed in a state of heightened alert, waiting for the inevitable confrontation with the person who had caused so much devastation. At approximately 11:24 p.m., officers finally apprehended the suspected shooter near Pine Grove Road. The suspect was taken into custody without incident, ending hours of uncertainty and fear. The arrest brought a mixture of relief and lingering unease. The immediate danger had passed, but the emotional wounds for the town and the families of the victims were only beginning to take shape. The individual responsible, identified as 24-year-old Derica M. Moore of Cedarbluff, faced 6 counts of murder, with additional charges expected as investigations continued. Prosecutors indicated that they would pursue the death penalty if the case proceeded to trial, underscoring the gravity of the acts committed and the seriousness with which the legal system would respond. The impact on Cedarbluff was profound. Families struggled to comprehend the events, grieving for loved ones while simultaneously wrestling with the fact that someone from their own town had caused such widespread harm. The town held vigils and memorials, lighting candles and leaving flowers in front of homes and public spaces where lives had been lost. Residents gathered in small groups to share memories, console one another, and try to make sense of how such violence could erupt in their quiet community. The sense of safety that had once defined Cedarbluff had been irrevocably altered, replaced by caution, sorrow, and a collective effort to heal. Authorities conducted a thorough investigation in the weeks following the massacre. Evidence from the crime scenes was meticulously documented, analyzed, and used to piece together the suspects' movements and motivations. Investigators interviewed witnesses, neighbors, and family members, seeking to understand the sequence of events that led to the loss of 6 lives. Psychologists and criminal behavior specialists studied the suspect to assess risk factors, motives, and patterns that could explain the unthinkable actions. Their findings would later inform discussions about early warning signs, the psychology of mass violence, and the steps communities might take to prevent similar tragedies in the future. Though the suspect was in custody, Cedarbluff's recovery would be slow and uneven. The families of the victims faced years of grief, the community grappled with collective trauma, and the sense of trust between neighbors had been deeply shaken. Candlelight vigils continued for weeks, and memorials were established to honor those lost, serving as both a reminder of the tragedy and a symbol of resilience. Cedarbluff had been forever changed by that winter night, a quiet rural town that now bore the scars of violence. The massacre left an indelible mark, demonstrating the fragility of peace, the impact of unthinkable acts, and the difficult, ongoing path toward healing for a community forced to confront a horror it never anticipated.